this should be a mantra for anyone working on web applications or web APIs. You should validate any input of the application as much as possible. When you kind of conceptualize it, all the kind of malicious input into your application comes across in an HTTP request at some point. It's either in the URL or in the body. That's generally speaking, unless you have a supply chain attack, that's generally the vector by which your application will be attacked. Before you even start to kind of think about specific vulnerabilities, if you narrow down what is permissible input right out of the gate, then you kind of close the door on so many different vulnerabilities without even thinking about it.
Welcome, friends, to the Modern .NET Show, the premier .NET podcast focusing entirely on the knowledge, tools, and frameworks that all .NET developers should have in their toolbox. We are the go-to podcast for .NET developers worldwide, and I am your host, Jamie Goprodman Taylor. In this episode, Malcolm McDonald joined us to talk about the importance of application security, knowing the basics of secure coding, and backing all of that up with both secure by default designs and subscribing to CV notifications. Along the way, he also discusses his new book, Grokking Web Application Security, and his website, Hacksplaining, so you should check both of those out.
So what you find in your career is that if you set down kind of sensible default behavior in your code base earlier on, then everyone will follow that. You establish kind of best practices. It may take a little bit longer, but if you say this is the way we do this over here, then even yourself, when you kind of come back to it, will kind of reproduce that path. So the initial kind of like first few check-ins to your source control are key to like establishing best practice.
One note before we begin. Some of Malcolm's audio is a little rough. Mark, our superstar editor, has done what he can, but there are parts that might be a little unclear. If you have trouble with the audio, please remember that there is a full transcription linked in the accompanying show notes. Anyway, without further ado, let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and we'll dive into the core of modern .NET. Hey, Malcolm, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I appreciate it whenever anyone wants to be on the show and hooks up with me, and that's probably not the right way to say it, but gets in touch with me and says, let's do this, let's talk about some stuff. So I really appreciate it. So thank you for spending the time with us.
Thank you, Jane. It's nice to be on.
Excellent. Well, it's nice to have you on. So I wonder, I ask all of my guests this. I wonder, there'll be people listening in going, who's this Malcolm chap? Would you mind perhaps giving us a sort of brief introduction, kind of like an elevator pitch, just so that everybody knows what, the kind of stuff that you do, the kind of work that you do. We're going to talk about your book as well, so we'll talk and hacksplaining and things like that. But I wonder, people are listening to this going, who's this guy? So who's this guy?
Okay, absolutely. I'll read straight off my LinkedIn profile if it helps. So I'm Malcolm McDonald. I'm a veteran developer, about 20 years, who specializes in web security. Most of my career has been in working at banks or fintechs, and most recently PayPal. But I'm currently the CEO and creator of a website called Hacksplaining, which is a web security training application. And as you mentioned, I have a new book coming out called Grokking Web Application Security on Manning Publications. So the bulk of my career has basically been in web application security, but I'm from a development background, so that's kind of the long and short of it. I should also mention, given the nature of the podcast, I'm not a C# expert. I've had the pleasure of working with the language at various points in my career, but I wouldn't kind of class myself as an expert at all. So bear that in mind. I'm not going to be recommending any specific libraries.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll cancel the spotlight to shine in your eyes, and I'll tell the bad cop to go away. That's what we'll do.
Okay.
No,
I find it in an audio format, it doesn't really, it's hard to talk about code except in abstract, so I'm not going to be It's when you learn to, you're actually mispronouncing function method names and class names for a long time. It's when you actually bring them up in a meeting. So I'll try and avoid that
Sure.
uh, pitfall.
Yeah, sure. I understand that. Well, I mean, so one of the reasons for having you on the show was I figured, a lot of .NET devs do web apps, and you're going to be talking today a little bit about your book, but also some of the things to do with hack explaining and some of the things that I think a lot of web app developers sometimes get not necessarily wrong, but not great when they're working on web apps. And so when we planned this out, I was hoping that we could talk like technology agnostic. That way, whatever we talk about is applicable to every kind of development, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that you've got this book coming in. So let's talk about that first, all right? So, um, I mean, I know the title of the book. Do you want me to say the title of the book, or are you happy just introducing the book to everybody?
Yeah, yeah. Why not?
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I know that the book is called, like you said earlier on, Grokking Web Application Security. So I guess the first question, and it's probably in the title of the book, but who is the book aimed at? Like, are you aiming this at juniors, at architects, at anyone in between? Like, can I get this for a friend of mine who's just started their journey in software development? Like they've qualified, they've got their first job, and they want to learn how to up their skills. Like, what's the pitch here for the book?
So yeah, I mean, you touched on a really, really kind of a good point there. It is. I wanted to write a book that had everything a junior developer needed to know about web security in one kind of 300-page book. In my kind of my past career, I've been in various situations where I've led development teams or mentored junior developers and things like that. Um, and I mean, given that almost every application you write nowadays on the internet, security is like a big part of what you need to know before you start releasing software. But there's so much material out there that it can be very intimidating just to sort of try and browse the internet, go through the OWASP or the MSDN sites, um, and try and kind of make sense of everything. So this book is essentially my attempt to kind of whittle everything down to just the essentials, uh, and not leave anything out. So it covers every aspect of web application security. Where there's more to learn, it kind of recommends further reading. But it's basically the book I would want to put on a new member of my team's desk and say, read this. Um, and come back with questions. Because it is, we all know the importance of security, but it can just be very intimidating to try and get started. So this is the essential, this is my attempt to kind of map the territory and say, these are all the things you should know. And at the same time, as I was kind of writing it, I was filling in kind of little gaps in my own knowledge. So it works very well for a more senior developer just to kind of brush up their knowledge. Because I mean, software changes quickly. Um,
Mhm.
and there's things that are threats now that weren't a couple of years ago. So it's a good, nobody wants to go to their manager and say, hey, I feel like I don't know enough about this stuff. So this is like the cheat book to say, hey, just read this stuff, um, and you will have a kind of a better sense of what's out there and what you should be worried about.
Sure, sure. One of the things that I often say to people that I work with, juniors or apprentices, I often take on an apprentice every year and just sit with them for 13 to 14 weeks of, 8 hours a day of let's build something real together. And one of the things that I say to them is, get a real grasp on the fundamentals, because it doesn't really matter to us to maybe 60%, 70% of the extent. Doesn't matter which language and technology and frameworks you're going to be working with. The fundamentals are all the same, right? So like I could quite easily write an insecure web app using .NET in the same way that I could write an insecure web app using Go or Rust or JavaScript, or it doesn't matter what technology, right? The fundamentals are all the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. It's what I found as I can become more advanced in my career, that when you learn, say, your second programming language, you actually kind of grasp your first language better. You basically realize what's specific to a language and what's just a general kind of technique across the board. Um, but yeah, it's you kind of brush up against the same concepts again and again, so they're fairly kind of applicable generally. And in most people's careers, would cover at least a couple of languages, even if you kind of have to reluctantly dip your toe in JavaScript, for instance, or whatever else.
Yeah, totally.
I'm not. I'm not.
I
I'm not bashing JavaScript. I do write Node most of the time nowadays, but it was quite a change of pace when I started swimming in those waters.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I found, because I've done quite a bit of work with React, and the thing that I
Mm-hmm.
found the hardest with React was not changing paradigms, was not thinking about this is a front end framework, was not none of that, none of the JSX, none of that. The thing that I found the hardest was the lack of a debugger. That was the hardest part.
Oh, I mean, Microsoft has like TypeScript and things like that for React now. So
Yeah.
it's I don't know. It's the tech world. They reinvent everything every 5 years. So like JavaScript's now getting back to where all the other languages were. So the debuggers are still a little unreliable, but
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
getting better.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it will get there. And you know, um, the work that has been put into JavaScript over the last 25 years is fantastic. So, you know, it really is coming along. It's a brilliant, these days, it's a brilliant language. Node is fantastic. And Dino, if you've ever used it, if you've never used it, Dino is really, really good. It's by the same chap who created Node, but I believe he describes it as what I would have made if I knew more about JavaScript before I made Node.
Well, that's interesting. That's we so rarely get a second chance to kind of fix our mistakes. I mean,
Yeah.
as you kind of touched on, most of we're all kind of generally working programmers. So like the code that goes out the door is the finished product, and we yeah we it'd be nice to be have the luxury.
That's true. That's true. So, so we've got Grokking web application security, and I know that you said it earlier on. There's hacksplaining.com, which is a website that you used to give out. Is it correct that you give out training on there and like extra sort of the next level up, I suppose, from the book? Is that right?
Yeah, so it's a precursor to the book. It was the reason the publisher approached me. Hacksplaining it's a completely free website. Includes 35 interactive exercises that demonstrate various vulnerabilities. Um, and it's aimed to be kind of more interactive than the kind of most sort of training. So to the extent that it's possible on a website, you are able to hack various applications, put yourselves in the shoes of an attacker, um, exploit a vulnerability in a kind of a dummy web application, and then go on to learn about, look at the code, see why it's vulnerable, and what could have been done to address it. So it's very kind of bite-sized um, kind of lessons. It's themed around these very, each vulnerability takes about half an hour to go through. And it's aimed to, like, if you have 30 minutes of your day you want to learn about, say, cross-site scripting or directory traversal or various kind of vulnerabilities, you can just dive in there. And it's become it became very popular because I shared on Reddit, and everyone's like, okay, this is way more explanatory than most material. And that's the target. I've had to run various kind of training sessions at kind of banks and fintechs. It's security training tends to be like pointing at PowerPoint slides. It's just so it can be so tedious. So this is an effort to make it kind of more interactive and just remove all the kind of unnecessary elements. So you see precisely how the vulnerability operates, what the risks are, and then you see code that addresses those vulnerabilities.
Right, right. Interesting, because that's so my experience of attending internal training for security best practices is definitely pointing out the PowerPoint, but then it's maybe this is the type of folks that I've worked with and alongside of in my career, but most of the time it's we're gonna give you, what is it, death by PowerPoint for 45 minutes. Then we'll tick a box and have an auditor sign to say that we've done the death by PowerPoint. So therefore, we'll make secure code from now on, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of institutions, they know about the importance of web application security, but and they're obliged to do kind of formal training. But generally speaking, we all have a good knowledge, maybe patchy in parts. So it's one size fits all isn't really kind of worth doing. It's, as you say, you just get very bored sitting in a meeting room or on Zoom or whatever. So this training is arranged around, okay, I know where the gaps in my knowledge are. I want to learn about cross-site script inclusion or kind of more obscure threats, and concentrate on that. So it's kind of self-guided. But yeah, it's yeah, as I said, I managed to get on the front page of Reddit with it, which means I've had traffic on and off for years. Also, it was horrendous on my server costs at the time. But I learned about what the Reddit hug of death is. So there you go.
Yeah.
I put scaling web applications on my resume.
Yeah, you definitely should. You definitely should. And, all of us know that the easy way to do that is just put it in front of Cloudflare, right? That's not the easy way to do it at all. I'm just being silly, everyone. Excellent.
Thankfully, it's largely static content nowadays. So I'm like, I can use a CDN for. But yeah, there's a whole separate podcast to talk about the challenge of scaling web applications. So
Definitely. Okay, so with the description of the book and the description of the website sort of taken care of, what I would love to do is to sort of pick your brains about some of the things that, without giving away the secret source of the book, or without giving away, hey, don't bother going to the website, check it. Please do go to the website, folks. But like, if I was wanting to pick up like the maybe top 3 things to do with web application security, and I was lucky enough to sit with you, say for instance over lunch, and say, right, where do I need to focus? Because from my perspective, having gone through the process of learning and still learning, right, life is a lifelong journey. Going through that process and trying to figure out where I should be spending my time to learn these things. Where would you say folks should start, right? Because like security itself is a massive thing. And then application security is slightly less massive, but still, equally massive. That doesn't make sense, but hopefully everyone knows what I mean. And then when you niche down to web application security, before you niche down by framework and technology, that's still a pretty big subject. So where am I starting? What am I doing?
I mean, the answer to that question really depends on uh, A, what you're working on, and B, your kind of degree of experience, I guess. I mean, if you want to, I do know this. I it's kind of sad. I think about this things late at night. It's like, what are the top three things to recommend to like a general developer starting out or looking for advice? Um, but yeah, there's there are kind of a bunch of kind of common themes in the book, um, which do kind of crop up again and again. One is, uh, and this is kind of like drills down by specificity immediately, but you should know how to be secure in the framework or library or language you're using. So nowadays, there is actually kind of generally good documentation for uh, for security on each of the kind of major frameworks. I think the best example of this is like this is a bit not really relevant to your listeners, but say the Ruby on Rails guide to security is front to back covers everything. Um, it covers everything that can happen on a web application and how the framework kind of protects against that. So that's the kind of thing you should be reading. It's like uh, if Google's working nowadays, it'd be like Google your language or framework and security. And if there's any kind of guide by the author of the framework or the team building it, um, they will have answered a lot of your questions. In many scenarios, you'll be like, you may find yourself wanting to know more about the thread itself rather than the kind of protections they put in. So that's where you branch out and do more reading. Um, but yeah, find some dedicated documentation about the framework you're using related to security and try and just kind of imbibe that very directly. Yeah. So I mean that's point one. I mean that can work uh, for modern frameworks. You might find, I mean, many of us spend most of our career working on kind of legacy code base and whatever. So it's that approach doesn't necessarily work. So the next piece of advice would be use the tools you're given. So try not to reinvent the wheel. This is kind of the largest source of security mistakes is when we build our own authentication, we try and do session management ourselves, or we do anything around encryption, where it's hand-rolled encryption is just a minefield of things that can go wrong. I mean, of course, there are developers out there who know this stuff, but I certainly am not smart enough to build this stuff from scratch. So just be very wary of if you seem to be kind of replicating things which may be built elsewhere. Just use what's off the shelf. It's not only will it kind of save you time, but it will also kind of it will kind of avoid you kind of stepping into the traps that the developers have already kind of avoided in the first place.
Oh, sure, yeah. If I can just butt in there just for a second there, Malcolm. There's an argument for building it yourself if you really desperately want to know how it works. But you know, but like, wasn't there a problem? Was it Heartbleed? It probably not that. All the vulnerabilities have such horrid names. But there was a vulnerability in OpenSSH. SSH? No, OpenSSL. The like the folks who write this have, PhDs in cryptography, and they got something wrong, right? And so I'm not speaking for you at all, Malcolm, but I don't have a PhD in cryptography, and I don't have several years of experience doing cryptographical stuff. So when it comes around to writing cryptography and authentication and stuff like that, I reach for a library, right? Because I don't want to get that wrong.
Yeah, and you should do. I mean, you're right. Like building it yourself is a great learning exercise, and I do recommend that. But you generally don't want that in production code. That should be like okay, I'm going to build a web scraper, or I'm going to build a little mini database, or uh, you once you kind of get really deep in the material, you get to experience why these things are difficult, and you appreciate what the existing libraries have done. But yeah, there's the things you should do in your day-to-day job, the things you should do on the side, um, and generally, like, just using the material supplied is the safer option.
Oh, most definitely. Yep, I agree.
It On the flip side is that uh, when these vulnerabilities are discovered in established libraries, you need to become aware of them very quickly and patch them. I mean, that's I've worked in various kind of banking software where it's secure because it's so obscurely built that nobody would take the time to hack it. But I don't think that's generally recommended.
Yeah, security by obscurity is never a good practice, in my opinion.
No, no. Yeah, and then
Yeah, sorry, I
the third
interrupted
theme.
earlier.
Oh, that's okay. So yeah, the third theme that kind of comes out in the book, and this is like really kind of this should be a mantra for anyone working on web applications or web APIs, is you should validate any input of the application as much as possible. I mean, when you kind of conceptualize it, all the kind of malicious um, input into your application comes across in an HTTP request at some point. It's either in the URL or in the body. That's generally speaking, unless you have a supply chain attack, that's generally the vector by which your application will be attacked. Before you even start to kind of think about specific vulnerabilities, if you narrow down what is permissible input right out of the gate, then you kind of close the door on so many different vulnerabilities without even thinking about it. So any piece of code which takes in an HTTP request or data from a request should be kind of restricting inputs the most minimal kind of range of acceptable inputs, and then that closes the door on so many different attacks. So there's essentially three approaches to that. One is the happiest one is you just have an allow list of permissible values. So you have upfront what the enumerated values are in a kind of request parameter or in the body. You reject anything else, and then that will make your HTTP endpoint super secure. Obviously, it doesn't work for things like email addresses. You're not going to know what the universe of possible email addresses. So you can also you can do block listing, so kind of removing anything which looks malicious, or kind of the old-fashioned kind of pattern matching. So it's like either a regular expression or just kind of removing any kind of illegal characters from a string before you kind of pass that information downstream. And that's really kind of the one thing. If you can kind of think through all the points at which your application takes HTTP input and processes it, then that's basically kind of the gates to the castle, and that's where you want to be securing things first.
Yeah. No, I haven't. I don't think I've explicitly been as I don't want to say explicit again, because that feels like it's a redundant word, but I'll use it for now. I haven't been as explicit with my apps when following this particular rule, but I can definitely say that you need to be validating. Assume that the user is not good, right? Assume that they are a bad actor. Validate as much as you can. And I often give an example of a story. It's a real thing that happened to me, or that I did a number of years ago. A large shall we say, fast food delivery service. I was on their website and I was getting some fast food delivered, and they had a box that was a user input box that was, please help us to find your house by giving us some details. Now, from your accent, Malcolm, I could tell you were from the UK at some point. Those who aren't in the UK, some of our houses tend to be really difficult to find. And so I was trying to type out, vague directions from where my address looked like it appeared on Google Maps to where it actually was. And I hit a character limit of 20 characters. And I'm like, well, this is just silly. There's no way, you can't say anything useful in 20 characters. So I did I'm telling you all this so that you know this and so that you don't go and do this. The particular website that I was using has been patched against this because I reached out to them after I broke their server with what I'm about to tell you. I did the old right-click inspect, and there wasn't a max length property, but what I noticed was there was some JavaScript running on the website. On the key up, it would check the length of that box, and if it was greater than 20, it would just ignore whatever you're typing. So I did what any developer would do and just stuck a breakpoint there and told it, no, it's fine. Just let all my key presses through. It's fine. Typed out what I needed to type out. And then I copied 4 paragraphs of lorem ipsum and hit post, hit send. And I never received that order because I broke the website because they were doing front-end validation only, right?
Yeah, it used to be my favorite technique when we're kind of validating internal apps is finding a text box and trying to cut and paste the entire text of Moby Dick into an input somewhere and see what happens. But yeah, there's a lesson there as well. Is that kind of validation for kind of string length should happen on the server side. So you shouldn't have been able to kind of break the server in that fashion.
Yep.
And this is kind of one of the things brought out in the book, actually, is that there's a kind of huge number of kind of client-side validations you can do usefully to guide users up front before you submit the web request. But everything, the essential validation for security should be on the server side. So anytime your HTTP request handler is taking input, it's like, what could go wrong? Is it overlong? Is it contain unusual characters? Is it malformed? That's the kind of the gateway into kind of most applications when you're trying to hack them.
The following is a paid advertisement. Welcome back, .NET enthusiasts. Today's special episode of the Modern .NET Show is brought to you with the help of Jamie Taylor, a renowned expert in software development and artificial intelligence. You may recognize his name from your favorite episodes, but did you know that he plays an even bigger role at RJJ Software? As our lead consultant, Jamie has guided numerous businesses to unlock their digital potential with bespoke solutions tailored to their unique needs. From crafting cutting-edge software to integrating advanced AI technologies, he's been pivotal in transforming challenges into opportunities. If your company is seeking a partner who can provide expert guidance and deliver exceptional results, look no further than RJJ Software. With Jamie at the helm of our consultancy team, we guarantee that we won't just meet expectations, we will exceed them. Dive into the digital future with us today. The audio for this advertisement was created with AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the phrase that you used there when you said you can use all sorts of client-side validation to guide the user rather than to stop them from sending something malicious. You're just guiding them in the direction of this is the kind of data that we want, right? You, like you said, you don't want to be relying on that client-side validation because I just proved I can right-click, inspect, and stop that validation from happening, right?
Yeah. No, I enjoy nowadays when you bring up the Chrome debugger, it's like it gives you a warning saying, do not cut and paste any code here from suspicious strangers for hacking Facebook or wherever else.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I hate is like, if you perform the validations as you're typing them in, and this is like a pet peeve of mine, but you're midway typing in an email address and it tells you this is not a valid email address. It's like, I haven't finished typing this field. Can you please
Yep.
have a little bit of patience? So,
Yep.
I mean, there's a whole other
I,
podcast about UI design, but I mean, it's
totally.
the big subject.
Yeah, I often liken that to, if you're ever having to sign up for, say you go to the dentist and they ask you to sign in and they say, oh, well, what's your name? We'll sign you in. And you say, well, my name's Jamie. And you get to the end of Jamie and they go, and your surname? Hurry up. You haven't said a full name yet. Come on. Like, that's what that is, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, it's common on bigger websites, but it also seems like there's nobody who writes this code ever actually use a website. Do you not get frustrated with the things yourself? Is this your um, first time doing this? Oh no, that's an interesting point actually, because it's we just all do kind of user stories and testing stuff like that. But a big part of like writing good applications is trying to think through how someone would use them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a lesson, kind of, I mean, developers or kind of people in tech don't get a reputation for like being particularly intuitive or like empathetic, but it can be really helpful to kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I do find that kind of writing user-facing code requires you to sort of be empathetic to their needs and kind of just kind of think through what would I want to do if I was facing this page and things like that. At the same time, it kind of going back to web security, it's like trying to think through how an attacker could attack your application. It's the same thing. It's like, if I was not necessarily a bad person, but a bored script kiddie, what could I do? For instance, disabling the key down listener in Chrome debugger and kind of pasting the text and Moby Dick to the text field. Yeah, there's a way of like trying to think, kind of step back from the code base and trying to act, kind of interact with the application in a way that somebody else would.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you shared one, I'd love to share one as well. My pet peeve is the incredibly secure websites that don't allow you to use password managers. It's a real like annoyance of mine, because it's really important to me that I have secure enough passwords, and so I don't know the passwords because they're all in password managers. And there's a certain website that I have to use every month to check some stuff, and they explicitly disallow password managers, which is against a whole bunch of advice from several different governmental bodies across the world that say you should not block the use of password managers. And in fact, blocking the use of password managers promotes bad password reuse. Password reuse, which is bad. And when I reached out to them and I said, look, right, please don't block password managers because I want to use all 48 characters that are available to me as because they allow up to 48 characters per password. So my password is 48 characters. It is that simple. And there is no way I'm ever going to remember it because I don't want to, because, I care about security. And they came back with, well, we adhere to, industry standard best practices. And so we block the use of password managers. And I'm like, no, there is no industry. The industry standard best practice for password managers is to enable them everywhere by default.
Yeah. I mean, we have kind of moved past the like password must be 8 characters with a number on the end. Thankfully. Yeah. I mean, before the kind of the use of password managers, I was terrible at password reuse. I can remember about 7 things, and one of those things is a password. So I reuse the same couple of passwords in a whole bunch of different places. Because again, it goes back to the kind of usability of the application. It's people can't remember these things. So there's a whole kind of chapter in the book as well about password policies. If you enforce various kind of characters, people will inevitably put a $ in if in the US or exclamation mark in the end. if you require a number, there'll be a number at the end. It doesn't really increase the complexity of the password in a meaningful way. The studies show that the longer password's good. Obviously, kind of a password manager where it's genuinely kind of arbitrary what the password is the strongest. So, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to for password managers. It's hard to think of. I don't have any more passwords in me. I can't think of another password.
Yeah, right.
I was for the longest time I was using the one that was assigned to me by my very first sysadmin. I was like,
Right.
okay, that's my password now. That's going to go in all the websites.
Yeah. Like you said, modern password management is tough. It's not a trivial problem to solve. Other than throw everything in a password manager and just trust it. That's what I do.
Yeah, I mean, one of these days the password managers will get hacked, but they're generally pretty secure. The only thing, the frustrating thing is like if you like, say, I use Chrome on my laptop, and then I have an iPhone, so they don't share the passwords. So I end up typing out these kind of really long strings, which is really frustrating. But yeah.
So I guess, what are some of your other pieces of advice then that are covered in the book, but without giving away all the secret sauce for the book, for making sure that we're building secure applications?
Actually, so since we're talking about passwords, that's a big thing. It is kind of building a strong authentication system. A lot of the time, the various kind of component parts of authentication will be kind of available via libraries or frameworks, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But there's situations where it can be useful, or the framework you're trying to use is too kind of overbearing, and it kind of enforces a certain kind of approach which doesn't gel well with the application itself. So I mean, authentication is an interesting thing to kind of solve for yourself, but be very wary of the pitfalls. It's the one place where there's kind of there's so many kind of things that can go wrong that you might not be familiar with. So, okay, I'm going to read off. It's my bullet point list. And if anything sounds unfamiliar to you as a listener, then go in, do some reading about it. So you should know how to hash passwords. So when you store a password, generally speaking, you don't want to know what the password is, but you want to be able to retest when it's re-entered again. And the way to do that is you store a one-way kind of encrypted hash of the password in your database, and you recalculate that value when it's re-entered. So that's kind of, I mean, hashing is a big area. And what you'll find if you go to Reddit and you'd say, I'm using this hashing algorithm, they will say, that's not strong enough, you should use something else. So everyone is very kind of vague about what you should be using. But nowadays, learn what bcrypt is. Bcrypt is the kind of somewhat the standard answer to what's a strong one-way hash. What's nice about it is you can up the complexity with a simple kind of parameter of the bcrypt library, and it's available in all different languages and frameworks. So that's a good one to use. The other thing is, I mean, the scenario you're protecting against here is like if somebody gets into your database, they shouldn't be able to have a full set of credentials they can start spamming other websites with. So in the worst situation, you will have a kind of users table, say, containing all the usernames and the encrypted password. And if it's well encrypted, then it's not really useful to the attacker. And then the other approach to that is Before you do the encryption, you inject an element of randomness called the salt or a pepper. And there's two different aspects of this. And that means that if two users have the same password, their hash will end up differently. And you have to save the kind of salt alongside the password hash when you kind of you do the test for when it's re-entered. And that really is like the difference between the salt and the pepper. Is salt is I actually kind of love the terminology here. I don't know which cryptographer came up with this. The salt is specific to each password and stored in the database. The pepper is common to all passwords. It's still the same element of randomness, but it's not stored in your database. So it's stored typically in a configuration store or even in your code base. So it means the attacker, in order to kind of attempt to kind of crack these passwords, has to get both pieces of information. You have to compromise two systems in order to even get started. So yeah, that's the kind of the industry standard. There's an exercise on password management on Hacksplaining actually that goes through. It's probably a better job of explaining it than I am doing right now. So that's a good thing to learn off about. And then actually while we're on the subject of authentication is if you want to move beyond passwords, and any kind of secure application should do more than just the username and password, then there's a whole kind of plethora of options for multi-factor authentication. So which means generally getting your phone out of your pocket and interacting with that device to kind of provide a second kind of factor or authentication factor to log you in. And that can look like, I don't know, Jamie, have you used the authenticator apps where you have to type in a 6-digit number?
Yeah, I have. And initially I didn't like them, but now I actually really like that. When I have to supply what do they call it? Time-based one-time passwords. Is that right?
Yeah.
Like supplying them is it makes me think, hey, in order to hack this account, not only does somebody need to know username and password, but now they need to have access to this particular instance of this app running at this time. So, it makes me feel like my accounts are more secure. Whether they are more secure or not, I don't know, but it makes me feel like they are.
I mean, the cryptographers will tell you they are, but I don't know. We all kind of put our trust in them. But yeah, that kind of thing, the one-time password via a kind of app is actually relatively simple to add to an application nowadays. So there's libraries for doing putting up QR codes and then syncing to, say, Google Authenticator or Authy or anything like that on the phone. And if you have a relatively sophisticated audience for your application, if they're kind of tech savvy, then it's not too much of a hurdle. And that will kind of generally close the door to all but the most sophisticated attackers. So it's definitely to be recommended. In the past year or so, we're seeing more and more sites using passkeys, which is it's newish, the web authentication standard. And it's generally kind of vaguely described because it's in the browser APIs. What it turns out to be is you end up taking a photograph, getting your phone's camera out, taking a photo of the QR code and then visiting a URL, which then your phone will kind of identify you on kind of the iPhone with like a Face ID, and then in the background the application will kind of recognize what's going on. That was very disconcerting the first time I came across that. It's like, why am I taking what's my camera on my phone got to do with this? Why is he involved in conversation? It's but yeah, it is the kind of same kind of security principle, and it's a little easier than typing out a 6-digit number.
If you're enjoying this show, would you mind sharing it with a friend or colleague? check your podcatcher for a link to the show notes, which has an embedded player within it and a transcription and all that stuff, and share that link with them. I'd really appreciate it if you could indeed share the show. But if you'd like a few other ways to support it, you could leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. So if you head over to .netcore.show/review, you'll find loads of ways to do that. You could consider buying the show a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is available on each show's show notes page on the website. This is a one-off financial support option. You could become a patron. This is a monthly subscription-based financial support option, and the link to that is included on each episode show notes page as well. I'd love it if you could share the show with a friend or colleague, or leave a rating or review. The other options are completely up to you, and are not required at all to continue enjoying the show. Anyway, let's get back to it. Yeah, it's still along the lines of that. I know it's not multi-factor, but it is that kind of idea of having more than one factor, right? I get a lot of pushback from people when I tell them we need to implement multi-factor authentication, and they say, but I have a username and a password. And I'm like, no. Those are one thing, right? That's something you know. You need to have something you have, or something you are, or something you can get. Those are factors, right? That's how I understand it anyway.
Yeah. So it should be, that's why you're kind of involving a secondary device, or potentially, like, if your laptop has a fingerprint recognition, you can also use that. But I'm always a bit. They had that on the iPhone and they took it away. I don't know. I don't know what their security practices there were. Maybe it was all fake.
Who knows?
Yeah, there's an element of like trust the experts, which you shouldn't generally do, but in this situation, it's like you only have much choice. And I'm kind of glad that sites are switching over to passkeys and web authentication, because there are so many like 6-digit numbers in my Google Authenticator app now. It gets quite difficult to scroll through them. It's like, how many GitHub accounts do I have? I should pare this down somewhat.
No, I know what you mean. So because I work as a contractor, I guess, in the US parlance, it's a consultant. So I have a whole stack of MFA apps on my phone, one for each client or whatever, right? And the reason that I do it that way rather than having one that has everything in it is because then at the end of that contract or the end of that piece of work, and if I'm definitely not going back, I can just uninstall and remove all of the data for the particular app for that particular client, and there's never any way I'm ever getting back into those accounts, right?
Yeah, it's good for them, but it's also like, kind of phone me on Friday night at 9 p.m. with a security problem because I can't get in. I deliberately lock myself out.
Yeah. Cool. So I know, because I've looked into it and I've gone through things like penetration tests and stuff like that. There is such a thing as a WASP, the Open Web Application the Open Web Application Security Project, which, if you don't know about it, folks, you should definitely check out after you've done reading Malcolm's book, by the way. And I know that they have like a top 10 of things that are important that people keep getting wrong in application security. Do you think people should start there, or is that just a good idea to just know that list exists?
It's a good starting point. There's a couple of things. They do actively go out and kind of do surveys and see what vulnerabilities are actively out there in the wild and being kind of taken advantage of. So it's a good map of the territory. The thing about the OWASP nowadays, it's rather than being super specific, it's more like a set of categories of different kind of classes of vulnerabilities. So it can be, it's a fair jump from going from the OWASP top 10, which you should know. You should at least be familiar with like the names of these vulnerabilities and what they generally entail, to actually how does this kind of look at the code base level and like how do I protect against this? So um, yeah, and again, not to oversell explaining, but explaining was my attempt to like make this more concrete. It's like this is not to learn web application security. It's certainly, from my point of view, I need concrete examples. Like, how is this exploited? How does it manifest, and how do you protect against it? And the OWASP site tends to kind of talk of things at a higher level. So it's like untrusted input. Don't use untrusted input, or things like that. But it's like, what does that mean? I can't conceptualize very abstract thoughts when I'm as a coder. So yeah, I mean, certainly read the JavaScript top 10. Kind of track it as it changes. They tend to refresh it every couple of years or so. But yeah, you should have to do some work to kind of make sure it relates to your day-to-day kind of practical coding, because it tends to be a little obscure. Also, I mean, Wasp as an organization, they do kind of great work, but their website is kind of a horrendous mess in places. So much is like out of date. I mean, because it's like a non-profit and it's not actively maintained, you can feel like some of this is super specific to Java developers using Java 1.4. It's like, how does this relate to kind of modern coding? So it's kind of can be patchy, and that's why it's a good idea to kind of find a security guide for the language or framework you're using. So like, a modern sort of .NET kind of security guide should tell you most things you need to know.
Sure.
They tend to be pretty frequently updated. On the other hand, if you're like, various points in my career, I've been maintaining ancient Visual Basic code bases. So you kind of on your own there. It's like legacy apps are there. I do wonder like how much of the internet is running on legacy apps. I kind of imagine most of it is.
Yeah.
You have the luxury. You have the luxury in the UK, Jamie, of having a national health service, the NHS. Over here, we have healthcare providers and private insurance companies which have the worst websites. Either banks or health insurers just tend to have like the most outdated, kind of ugly websites that are clearly running on kind of PHP 1.0 or whatever else.
Yeah. I whilst I have no concrete proof, it's all anecdotal evidence. I am pretty sure that a lot of our maybe not critical infrastructure, I don't want to scare people, but a lot of our modern infrastructure is actually just built on lots and lots of legacy stuff, right? It's legacy all the way down. And that kind of really, it worries me a little, personally, because I know things like, with things like COBOL and things like that, those technologies that a lot of, not all, but a lot of the older financial institutions and things like that are built on things like COBOL. And I've said it quite a few times on the show, and I'm reluctant to say it again, but there's very few people alive who can write COBOL now, right? Let alone read it. So, what do we do?
I mean, yeah, even not kind of going back as far as that, it's a lot of kind of big companies, the code base gets established and handed down as people leave and join the company, and it becomes an exercise in archaeology to kind of just keep this thing running. So that's common enough. I don't know if I don't know if I'm allowed to speak too much about the PayPal infrastructure, but you would be surprised how much of the financial sector is running on very, very old code, which is kind of battle tested, so there's an advantage to it. But it's there's so much kind of people, kind of little workers going in there and rebuilding things as it's running live that it's sometimes amazing to think these things actually still up and running. PayPal is
Yeah.
very secure, and definitely trust your money with them. So don't worry about that.
Of course.
The other kind of system, interestingly, I kind of learned about recently was a lot of the kind of credit card companies still use fax machines, or at least to kind of use fax channels behind the scenes to kind of transfer documentation and things like that. So it's once this technology is in there, it never really kind of gets replaced.
Yeah, because it's not broken, right? It's still working.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's never. I kind of dotted around various jobs in my career, and it's like it's never fun to get put on like, hey, maintain the stack, try and fix this code that's completely alien to you, and try and just kind of get presented with a code base where it's a completely kind of outdated paradigm. It's been chugging along on a couple of like Windows or Linux servers for a decade. But I mean, that's the job. That's what we are. A lot of us are kind of maintenance engineers, and that's kind of necessary to kind of do. So I don't know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I'm conscious of the time that we have together, and I wonder if if you have another 5 or so minutes, I'd love to get your thoughts on secure by default. I know that means we've kind of not very nicely segued into something, but if you have the time, have you got like the next 5 or so minutes?
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome.
So actually, I have a good segue for that. So the way I write code, and I think this is the way that most people approach kind of problems, is we don't like to admit it. What we do is we take an existing code base and then we tweak it. So much of our work is kind of replicating patterns which are already in there, whether it be it from Stack Overflow or ChatGPT or like a blog post somewhere, or just using existing, copy across existing classes and then renaming things like that. And that's kind of, it just saves you time. It's a sensible way of doing things because it's particularly with boilerplate code. So what you find in your career is that if you set down kind of sensible default behavior in your code base early on, then everyone will follow that. You establish kind of best practices. It may take a little bit longer, but if you say this is the way we do this over here, then even yourself, when you kind of come back to, will kind of reproduce that pattern. So the initial kind of like first few check-ins to your source control are key to like establishing best practice. So that's what I like to think about the by kind of default behaviors, like just add the code base, just kind of starting out on the right foot, and then you kind of set the template for other people to follow. The other aspect of like secure by default is probably just assume that your application will get attacked at some point. Most of us are writing code which goes on the internet or kind of is called from HTTP in some fashion. So you can assume that there will be maybe just drive-by attacks. If you're a high-profile target, there'll be like more specific attacks. So assume that somebody's going to try and hack you from day one, which is kind of intimidating. But if you follow kind of just a fairly kind of sensible set of guidelines around security, it's like it's not at a high risk. Most of us are not going to get targeted by some kind of high-end Russian hacking group with a fun kind of a code name at the FBI. Most kind of attacks on the internet are basic kind of scripts that just kind of poll URLs and check for admin pages on WordPress and things like that, or they do kind of SQL injection attacks. So as long as you're kind of closing the door on this kind of the low risk attacks, you are generally kind of be secure in the long run.
Right, yeah, I can speak to some real world experience of those low level attacks. One of the websites for one of the apps that I've built routinely gets people trying to go to /wp-admin.php, which is the login page for WordPress. And so and he doesn't use WordPress, so that's where your analytics comes in. But what's great about what I did was I set up a 301 redirect that if anyone goes to wp-admin.php, they're bounced automatically to Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up.
They're looking for some very disappointed attacker. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like if you do have a kind of a website with any kind of traffic, you do see these kind of very familiar attacks, just clearly just kind of scripts pinging stuff. I don't know what the kind of value of kind of hacking someone's WordPress site is, but I guess it's easy enough to do, and there's so many unpatched instances, then it's worth the attacker's time. There's a whole chapter in the book as well, and on the website about kind of updating dependencies and kind of patching security holes. Because there's another aspect to building a code base is maintaining it. So just like being on top of when there's new vulnerabilities and knowing how to address them is, it's another aspect of our jobs. You may have an in-house security team as well if you're looking at a big enough company, but we should be kind of mindful of that at the same time. The aim is that when the security team come knocking, asking, have you patched the heartbeat vulnerabilities if you were already there? You can say it's all taken care of, but
yeah,
that involves a fair bit of kind of scanning Reddit or Hacker News or the social media sites and stuff. Or listening to Jamie's podcast.
Yeah, I often tell people that the best way to first off, know what you're running. So if you can get SBOMs or just like know what things you are using to build your stuff, and then go ahead and sign up for mailing lists, the official mailing lists for those things, right? Because you don't always find it, but most of the time you find that that they will announce, hey, there's this really critical vulnerability and you need to upgrade, either publicly on like their social medias or through a mailing list. And so you get to know that pretty quickly.
Yeah, mailing lists are a great one for that, particularly because when you have a widely kind of deployed library or framework, if there is a vulnerability, then immediately hackers will start scanning for it. So if you're sharing a code base with other people, you don't want to be behind the curve on patching, because then you are definitely a target. So that's one aspect.
Definitely.
On the other hand, if you're maintaining COBOL code base from 30 years ago, then that's less of a concern. But there's different ways of securing an application. There's different kind of concerns depending on the recency of your framework.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Excellent. Well, as we start to wrap up, Malcolm, I wonder, would you be able to remind listeners of the book and the website? And so then obviously they can go ahead and go and take a look at those things and check them out. And then maybe, would you mind doing that?
Sure. Yeah. So the book, which I've touched on a couple of times in the podcast, is called Grokking Web Application Security. It's out on Manning Publications, but it's available on Amazon and so on. And the website, which is a kind of more interactive version of the same thing, more kind of focused on specific vulnerabilities, is called Hacksplaining.
And that's
I've always been a bit indifferent about the name, but it's memorable at least.
Yeah. It's kind of like the word explaining, but with hack instead of the EX, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'll get links to those and put those in the show notes so no one has to like figure any of that out whilst they're listening. So that's not a problem. And I would like to thank you, Malcolm, for spending part of what I'm guessing is your morning and my evening doing this recording because I feel like regardless of, like I said at the beginning, regardless of the tech stack involved, and yes, there are nuances like, hey, how do I secure a .NET app versus how do I secure a Java app versus how do I secure a Go app? There are nuances in each of the frameworks and technologies, but I feel, and I may be wrong about this, but I feel like you've proved my point for me, that there are a number of things that are super important that it shouldn't really matter which language and framework that you're using. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of that stuff with the listeners.
It's been a pleasure, Jamie. And yeah, you're right. It's most of our code it's a machine for understanding HTTP requests. So yeah, the vulnerabilities kind of crop up across the board.
Excellent. Well, like I said, Markham, thank you ever so much for spending this time with us, and best of luck with the book.
Okay, thanks, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Modern.NET Show with me, Jamie Taylor. I'd like to thank this episode's guests for graciously sharing their time, expertise, and knowledge. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at the podcast's website, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .NETCore.show/review for ways to do that, or reach out via our contact page at .NETCore.show/contact, or even join the Discord server at .NETCore.show/discord, all of which can be found in the show notes. But above all, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope that I'll see you again next time for more .NET goodness. See you again real soon. See you later, folks.